The sound of a blade slicing through metal fills the room. Outside, the night is eerily still, but inside the morgue, an unsettling echo lingers in the air. The fluorescent lights flicker faintly, casting strange shadows. Something about this place feels off, as if death itself is not as final as we believe. Bodies lie on cold, steel tables, but are they truly lifeless? This is the story of a morgue where the line between the living and the dead begins to blur, and it all starts on a seemingly ordinary night. It began with a man, his identity unknown, his features hollow, his skin ashen. He was found stumbling along a dimly lit alley, his clothes tattered and torn as if he'd been wandering for days, maybe weeks. His eyes were wide, unblinking, yet devoid of life. He didn't respond when spoken to, nor did he make a sound as he was guided into the morgue. He was placed on the cold, stainless steel table, and the doors closed with a quiet thud. The technician, a man who had seen more death than he cared to admit, was preparing his instruments. The soft buzz of the overhead lights was the only sound in the sterile room. The body was cold, almost unnaturally so. But something didn't feel right. As the technician examined the man, his hands froze. There was again the faintest rise and fall of the chest. Not enough to be mistaken for a breath, but undeniable. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer, almost daring to believe his own senses were playing tricks on him. For a long moment he watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of it all. The man should have been long dead. At least that was what the reports had said. But here he was, lying on the table, breathing, or something close to it. His fingers hovered over the man's wrist, feeling for a pulse, praying it wasn't there. But when his fingertips brushed the cold skin, there it was, a faint, erratic pulse, like the heartbeat of something not entirely human. He recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. As the silence stretched, the body stirred. Not in the way a corpse would, no twitch, no muscle spasms. It was a subtle movement, like the air itself had shifted, and for a moment, the technician felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. The hairs on his neck stood on end. What was this? How was this possible? The man's chest rose and fell again, slower this time. A guttural, rasping sound came from deep within his throat. The technician's stomach churned with dread. He didn't know what he was witnessing, but he knew one thing. This was only the beginning, and he was not alone in that room. The technician stood frozen, his breath shallow as he watched the man's body twitch again. The room seemed to grow colder, the flickering lights overhead casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. He couldn't take his eyes off the body. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to leave this place and never look back. But something kept him rooted in place, like an invisible force had him trapped. His hand trembled as he reached for the medical chart, scanning the details for any signs of life. But there was nothing, no medical history, no explanation for how this man had ended up on his table in the first place. And yet, here he was, defying the laws of life and death. As the technician tried to steady his breathing, the sound of the morgue's door creaked open behind him. Startled, he spun around, but no one was there, just the empty hallway beyond. The air felt thick now, heavy with something unspoken. He glanced back at the man on the table. The faint rise and fall of the chest had stopped. For a moment, the technician dared to believe it had all been a figment of his imagination. But then it came, that sound, a low, rasping breath. Not from the man, but from behind him. His heart raced as he slowly turned, the cold sweat pooling at the back of his neck. And then a voice, barely audible, whispered from the shadows, "Help me." The technician's eyes darted toward the table, but the man was still motionless, staring up at the ceiling with those hollow eyes. The whisper came again, louder this time, unmistakable. "Help me." His pulse quickened, his mind a whirl of confusion. Was this some sort of twisted prank? Was someone playing a sick joke on him? Or was something far darker at play? He turned back to the doorway, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was in sight. The body that had been dead, was it dead? With a feeling of dread closing in on him, the technician took a hesitant step toward the table. His hand shook as he reached out, unable to tear his eyes away from the man's face. It was as if something was pulling him closer, something he couldn't explain, some dark force luring him in. As his fingers brushed against the man's wrist, he felt it. A sudden, sharp jolt of coldness, not like death, but something older, something ancient. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, his breath now visible in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting strange shadows on the walls. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, for a split second, everything went black. The lights flickered back on, and the technician gasped, stumbling back as the body on the table was gone. The sheet that had been covering him lay empty, the edges crumpled as if something had been there, something far too heavy to be ignored. A chill crawled down his spine. The door slammed shut with an unnatural force, trapping him inside. He was no longer alone. The technician's breath came in ragged gasps as his eyes darted across the room, searching for any sign of the body. His heart pounded in his chest, echoing in the otherwise silent morgue. The room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in around him. He pressed his back against the cold steel of the autopsy table, his hands gripping the edge as if it could somehow ground him. But the room was empty now. The body had vanished, leaving no trace. Not even a faint scent of decay lingered in the air. The floor beneath him creaked, a low groan that sounded almost like a warning. The flickering lights above buzzed loudly now, as if they too were in pain, struggling to stay on. He turned in frantic circles, but there was no one there. Just the cold, empty tables with their bodies, silent and unmoving. Yet, the silence felt more oppressive than before, as if something was lurking just beyond his sight, watching, waiting. Suddenly, he heard it, a sound, faint at first, like a whisper in the air. Then it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from any of the bodies, but from somewhere deeper. The floor? No. The walls. The walls seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound, a resonance that rattled his bones. He stepped forward cautiously, trying to listen, trying to understand what was happening. That's when he noticed it. A faint shadow creeping along the far wall. It wasn't a trick of the light. This shadow moved, and not in a way a shadow should. It seemed to shift, to change shape, bending unnaturally. The technician's pulse raced. He took another step, and that's when he saw it. The faintest outline of a figure, half hidden in the darkness. The air grew colder still, and a shiver ran through his body. His mouth went dry. He wasn't sure whether he should run or stay, but before he could make a decision, the figure moved. It was fast, too fast. The technician stumbled backward. almost losing his footing. His heart hammered in his chest as he fought to breathe, his mind spiraling into panic. But when the figure came into view, he froze. There, in the corner of the morgue, standing perfectly still, was the man. Or what used to be the man. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes black as coal, wide and unblinking. His mouth open, but no sound came out, just a horrifying, silent scream. The technician's body tensed, his limbs refusing to move as the figure stepped forward. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on him from all sides. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the shadowy figure moved closer. Suddenly, the man's mouth opened wide, and this time there was a sound, not a scream, but a low, guttural growl, something animalistic, and with it, the overwhelming sensation of being trapped. The lights flickered again, and the technician's eyes darted around. The room was closing in on him. He couldn't escape. He wasn't supposed to be there. Then, in a voice that barely registered as human, the man whispered, "It's not over. We never left." The technician's breath caught in his throat. His legs trembled beneath him as the figure moved closer still, the air around them growing colder, darker. He couldn't think, couldn't move. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. The shadow loomed in front of him now, its presence suffocating. The technician felt his heart stop. He wasn't alone in this room, and whatever was standing before him was not human. The technician's chest tightened as he stood face to face with the shadowy figure, his mind racing with thoughts too frantic to process. What was this? What was he? The figure's hollow eyes seemed to pierce through him, as though it could see every secret buried deep inside his soul. The room was suffocating, the air so thick it felt as if it were choking him. The man, or whatever he had become, took another step forward, his body jerking unnaturally. A low, almost guttural sound filled the room, the vibrations reverberating through the walls. The technician's thoughts fractured, swirling into a haze of fear. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor, as though the darkness itself had wrapped him in chains. In the stillness, the figure spoke again, its voice more distinct now, but still a whisper carried on the cold breath of death. "You should have left long ago." With those words, everything seemed to shift. The walls seemed to warp, the room stretching impossibly wide, as if the very fabric of reality were unraveling. The technician's vision blurred, the world spinning around him as the dark figure continued to advance. He felt himself being drawn toward it, his body moving against his will. Every instinct screamed for him to resist, to break free. But his limbs were no longer his own. They were under the control of something else, something ancient, something that had never truly died. As the figure closed in, the technician's mind reeled. Was this some twisted trick of the morgue's dark history? Had the place somehow become cursed, trapped in a cycle of death and resurrection? Or was it something far worse, a force that fed on fear, a presence that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface? And then the truth hit him like a tidal wave. The morgue wasn't just a place for the dead. It was alive, not in the way humans are alive, but in the way something older than time itself can be. A place where death wasn't the end, but the beginning of something far more terrifying. The technician's thoughts blurred as the realization washed over him. The bodies in the morgue weren't dead. Not entirely. They were trapped trapped in a cycle of life and death that never truly ended. The man on the table had never truly died, and neither had any of the others. They were caught between worlds, restless souls forced to live out in eternal torment, their bodies only shells of what they once were. "Help me!" The whisper came again, this time from every direction, the voices of countless others echoing in his mind. The technician's body shook uncontrollably, his breath ragged as the cold, oppressive energy grew stronger. The shadows swarmed around him, pressing in from all sides. "We are the forgotten." The walls seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with the unnatural force that filled the room. And in that moment, the technician knew that he would never leave. He would become one of them, a lost soul, trapped forever in the morgue's endless cycle. But before the darkness consumed him entirely, the figure turned toward the back of the room. There, standing in the doorway, was someone else, another figure. This one was familiar. The technician's heart skipped a beat. It was the man who had entered the morgue earlier, the one who had brought the body in. But now, he was no longer human. His eyes were as black as coal, his mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. And as he stepped forward, the technician realized with chilling clarity, he wasn't here to help. He was part of it all, a keeper of the damned. The technician's body stiffened in terror. He had become the next in a long line of lost souls. But his horror was not over yet. The technician's heart raced, his pulse echoing in his ears as the shadowy figure moved toward him, its every step deliberate, predatory. The air around him grew colder, suffocating, as if the very room was tightening its grip on his soul. He tried to scream, to fight back, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the heavy silence that seemed to press down on him. The man in the doorway, no, the creature, moved closer, his features twisting unnaturally, his skin stretched taut like leather over bones. His eyes, black as voids, gleamed with something ancient, something that spoke of horrors beyond comprehension. The technician's legs felt like lead, his body frozen, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, the creature spoke. "You were never meant to leave, technician. You never should have come." The technician's thoughts were in turmoil, racing through fragments of memories. The morgue, the bodies, the whispers. The man who had brought in the first body, he was one of them, wasn't he? A keeper of the dead, cursed to wander these halls, forever seeking new souls to add to the collection. The technician's skin crawled as the horrifying truth sank in. The morgue wasn't just a place where the dead were kept. It was a prison, and he had unknowingly stepped into it, becoming part of its endless cycle of torment. The figure reached out, a hand as cold as death itself brushing against his skin. The technician's mind screamed as his vision blurred, his thoughts slipping away like sand through his fingers. He could feel the life draining from him, his strength fading with each passing second. "No, no," he gasped, but it was too late. The creature's grip tightened, and the technician's world collapsed into darkness. When the technician regained consciousness, the first thing he noticed was the silence, the deep, unsettling silence of the morgue, the cold steel of the table beneath him. His body ached, as though he had been torn apart and put back together. He could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the chill in the air seemed to bite at his skin. But something was wrong. He wasn't alone. A low, guttural moan came from the corner of the room, followed by a whisper, faint and distant. "Help me." The technician's eyes shot open, and he sat up, gasping for air. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. He looked around, but there was nothing in the room. No bodies on the tables. No shadows lurking in the corners. Just an empty, desolate morgue. Or was it? The whispers grew louder, and as the technician struggled to stand, he saw something moving in the far corner of the room. A figure, hunched and grotesque, its skin stretched thin over bone. The figure turned toward him, and its eyes, those same dark, empty eyes, locked onto his. "Welcome," the figure rasped, its voice like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. "You're home now." The technician's breath caught in his throat. He knew what he had become. He had become one of them, one of the lost souls trapped in this place. The cycle was unending. The morgue had claimed him, and it would claim many more. Forever. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, and the technician felt a cold, numbing sensation creep over him. His body stiffened as he was pulled back toward the table, unable to resist. He knew, with horrifying clarity, that he was now a part of this twisted, eternal cycle. The creature's voice echoed in his mind, a final warning: no one leaves. Not unless they bring someone new. As the technician felt his body being pulled into the darkness, the door to the morgue slammed open with a deafening crash. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light outside. The technician's eyes widened in shock. It was the man, the one who had brought the first body in. But now, his eyes were wide and frantic, his hands trembling. He stepped into the room, looking around at the unnatural stillness, the silence that filled every corner. The technician's heart skipped a beat. The man looked directly at him, his face pale and filled with dread. I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And with that, the technician realized he wasn't the first to be caught in this web of horror. The man was a part of it too. They were all part of the same cursed cycle, trapped in a never-ending loop of death and rebirth, unable to escape. The technician's final thought before the darkness took him was a single, terrible question: how many others had come before him? The air in the morgue grew heavy, suffocating, as the technician tried to process the new truth. The man, the one who had unknowingly helped him fall into this hell, was now a part of the cycle too. His trembling hands were evidence of the horror he had witnessed, the curse that bound him. The figure who had been the technician's tormentor stepped back into the shadows, watching, waiting, and with each passing moment, the space around them seemed to shift. The room, once so familiar, now felt like a nightmare, distorted and wrong. The flickering lights cast harsh, jarring shadows across the floor, moving like creatures, slithering across the cold steel. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" The words echoed, growing from a murmur to a maddening chorus, as if the walls themselves were screaming. The technician's stomach churned. The voices came from everywhere, from the dead bodies that lay in waiting, from the very walls that seemed to pulse with life. They were everywhere. His breath quickened, and he turned toward the man who had opened the door. His mouth moved, but no sound came. The technician saw the look in his eyes, the understanding, the realization that they were both now bound to this place. The man's face had been drained of hope. His eyes were empty, resigned. Without a word, he moved toward the technician, his steps slow and deliberate. His eyes darted around the room as if expecting the shadows to come to life, to pull them into the dark. The technician tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The air felt thick with some malevolent force that choked off his words, keeping them locked inside. And then the whispers grew louder, so loud they seemed to vibrate his very soul. They filled every corner of the room, swirling like wind through a cave. The man in front of him suddenly staggered back, clutching his head as if in pain, his face contorted, as if fighting an internal battle against something he couldn't control. And then, with a hollow scream, he collapsed to his knees, his eyes wide with terror. The technician rushed to his side, but it was too late. The man's skin had turned pale, almost translucent. His body seemed to shrink, as though the life was draining out of him, his limbs becoming stiff, his face frozen in an eternal mask of fear. The shadows seemed to pull at him, dragging him toward the cold steel table. The technician could barely breathe as the horrifying reality unfolded before his eyes. The man wasn't just dying. He was becoming one of them, a part of the cursed cycle. The technician knew, deep down, that this was his future too. He could already feel it. The darkness closing in, the endless whispering, the coldness creeping into his very soul. But then something shifted. The walls of the morgue seemed to tremble, the air crackling with tension. The technician's eyes widened as he saw the dark figure reappear, stepping out from the shadows with the same predatory grace it had before. This time, its eyes were fixed on him, filled with an unreadable hunger. And for the first time since entering the morgue, the technician felt the cold hand of truth grip him. The shadows, the voices, the cursed cycle. It was all part of a darker plan. The morgue was a prison, but not just for the dead. It was a prison for souls, for those who had dared to walk too close to the unknown, those who had ignored the warning signs, the whispers, the things that shouldn't be. It was a trap, and it wasn't just the dead who were trapped in its clutches. The figure's voice, now unmistakably real and chilling, echoed in his mind. You were chosen. The technician's body trembled, his heart beating wildly in his chest. He was no longer fighting. There was no way out, no escape. His body, his very essence, was being pulled into the darkness. The figure reached out, its long, cold fingers brushing his cheek, and as it did, he felt something snap within him. He understood now. He was one of the lost. He would never leave. His soul would join the others in the endless whispering, the eternal torment. He would become part of the morgue's twisted cycle, an unwilling keeper of the dead. With the final tug, he felt himself give way. The darkness swallowed him whole. His last breath was stolen by the cold air, the shadows closing in around him. The whispers filled his ears, drowning out everything else. And then silence. The next morning, the morgue was quiet. The bodies on the tables were still. The walls were as cold as they had always been. But in the shadows, something stirred. Another soul had joined the cycle. Another lost technician. Another whisper. And the darkness grew.